So to say that my name is Madhulata Patel, and thank you very much for coming along today. A bit about myself. Basically, I spent about 22 years working across housing, health and social care, including roles in leadership and management. I have vocational and academic qualifications that have informed my practice, and I was course leader for the pilot level 4 step up to management from the very start, which was November 2015. And I was involved in teaching the final cohort of students, which was July 2019. Right, and really I did very much live and breathe the award. So in terms of, for example, developing the specification, the marking, the teaching, the liaison with external examiner, and also from an initial pilot in South Wales to taking the award nationally. As Karen said, there will be 2 chances to gain an understanding of this first unit. Unit 410, Legislation, Theories and Models of Person and Child-Centred Practice. So I'll be going through it today, but also there will be a support network meeting on the 23rd of March, and we will have a break at 2 o'clock anyway, but also I will ensure that I finish at 3:10, so there's an opportunity to take any questions. Now, when I run through these masterclasses and also the network support meetings, what I'll be talking about is the result really of feedback from the students in terms of the initial pilot, which was Step Up. And as you can imagine, over those 4 years, we were constantly making changes. So there were some things that worked great from the very start. There were other things with the nature of any new award that it didn't go to plan, and we had to think then about revisiting. But ultimately, eventually, we ended up with an award. And so, for example, the units that I'll be talking you through, they are as a result of tried and tested experience. So the reason that Karen asked me to come along and lead these masterclasses and also the network support meetings is what I'm hoping that you'll see is that I'm not going to go over so much what you've already had access to, such as the publications and the guidance, but really what I would like to do is share with you my insight from the practice of running the course and working with others to run the course. And then obviously you will now be taking this level 4 qualification forward. And so I hope that what you can see is that what I'm doing is making suggestions, sharing insight, but obviously then you will now be taking this qualification on to the next stage. And by all means, feel free to look at some of my suggestions or look at what I'm saying and saying, oh, well, actually, we don't think that's going to work for us, or, you know, we think we could improve upon that. And to me, that's brilliant, because that's the whole point, is that I can share where I was with that pilot award, and then it is about you taking it forward even further. And so I really hope that you will find these masterclasses and support groups to be useful. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide now. So the program then is from 1 till 2 o'clock. I'll talk about the initial assessment and induction. I will then talk about some of the learning content. We'll take a break at 2 o'clock, and I'll just ask for you to do something small during the break. And then at 2:30, we'll go through the assessment. I will make sure that I keep to time. And as I say, if there's anything that I run through and you feel like I'm not sure about that, we can address that at 3:10, but also we will have that meeting afterwards, so that there will be a few opportunities to revisit each unit and any queries that you might have. Okay, so in terms of the initial assessment and induction, this is the first unit of this qualification. And so, in a sense, what you do in this very first unit is critical, and it really sets the scene for the following units and also for the learners or the students' success on the qualification as a whole. So some key messages is that I have for you is that the initial assessment, and I'll come on to that, and the induction is critical, and time and effort spent at this point will save time in the long term. So for example, what I could say is that when we ran the pilot with the very first cohort of students, we underestimated the need for that induction. And so we had some students who really struggled because we hadn't allowed for time to give them sufficient grounding in terms of the academic skills that were needed, so that they had an understanding of the academic skills that were needed, and that we had time to think about what did they need to learn and how could they get any skills that they were short of. As a result, for subsequent cohorts of students, we recognise that that induction was critical, and so we devoted time to that induction and made sure that students had an understanding around what academic skills are, and if they're lacking, where they can be obtained. So in terms of the initial assessment, my suggestion is that you ask the student to develop a written statement, and I'll go into more detail on that in a minute. But what I would suggest is that in terms of the initial assessment, what you're doing is you are using that initial assessment to assess whether the learner or the student has what is needed to complete this first unit and this qualification. So remember, this qualification is preparing people for a role in leadership and management. So given that this is about preparing people for leadership and management roles and the level 5, what you're doing, in a sense, is you're assessing two things. You're assessing, does the potential student have what is needed in terms of the skills and the commitment and the understanding of what is required in this qualification to go forward, successfully complete this qualification? And also, can you see that there is that potential there and you can see them successfully moving into a leadership and a management role? What I really can't stress enough is that it's vital that you don't skip over the induction and the initial assessment. This is a really fundamental and critical stage before moving on to the learning materials. And it's a point at which both you and the learner or student need to feel confident that they have what is needed to make a success, really, of being on this qualification. So it's suggested that one way, a starting point in which this can be done, is via an initial assessment. So what you're asking the learner or student to do is provide a written personal statement, and you're asking the learner or the student to outline their career plan and to identify where their qualification fits in with their career plan. And hopefully what you would see in that written account is the learners or the students understanding that what they are doing is, by completing this qualification, preparing to go on to their level 5 qualification and a role in leadership and management. By doing this initial assessment, you are asking the person to write a written statement, and also it gives them time to think about any support that might be required with their study or learning skills. My suggestion as well is, in terms of that initial assessment, is what you could do is build in a discussion, oral evidence between the learner and or student and yourself, if you're the tutor, about their personal statement and the learner guide. So on the website, there is the learner guide, which provides guidance on the level 4 qualification, and it's a good way. So in a sense, what you're doing is the assessment is in two ways, in terms of you're assessing the writing, but you're also assessing the verbal communication. So this could be an ideal way of assessing a person's written and oral skills, to see where they are based on your assessment as opposed to theirs. Now, the reason I say that is because sometimes can be very different things. So experiences, we would come across some students who we would say, you know, what do you think of your academic skills? And they would say, oh, I'm not very good, you know, I don't think I'm very good. But actually, when you saw their work, it was fine. So their self-perception was that they weren't very good, but actually that was linked to a lack of confidence, as opposed to the reality of their situation. Unfortunately, we would also have the reverse, where sometimes a student might have a view of their skills, and it didn't always might need. Now, some people might need specific support, for example, because of specific needs, such as they have a specific disability or dyslexia or other needs. So this personal statement would be a nice piece of work for someone to do to enable that link to be formed between the learner or the student and the tutor. And then, as you can see, the guidance there is your tutor would contact you to have a discussion, because remember that in this level 4 qualification, there will be a requirement for verbal skills as well as written skills. So by doing this initial assessment, and it is referred to in the guidance, what it gives you an opportunity to do is assess skills such as, has the person understood the task and completed it as required? Because when you think in terms of your support for your learner or your student, you'll be asking them to do both formative or practice tasks before doing their summative task. And a really important fundamental of any qualification is where you're given a task to do, and have you understood the task correctly? Do you know what's expected of you, so that you can produce the result, whether it be a formative assessment or a summative assessment, have you done what is expected of you? Similarly, the good thing about this personal statement is what you can do is you can actually see then, where is this person in terms of their competence to write in a formal or academic style? Also, can they use IT, and are they able to have a reasoned discussion? Another really important aspect of this qualification, or any qualification, is it will also enable you to develop some insight into that person's personal interest and motivation. And yes, I know that this qualification is compulsory, but even so, the fact that it's compulsory won't be enough to motivate someone to get through, because a lot of us have had those pressures of, for example, working full time and studying and childcare and all the other things that go with things. And so, and it is an extremely challenging qualification, and rightly so. And so it is a good time in terms of this initial assessment for you to gauge what is that person's level of personal interest. Are they motivated to learn and develop? Because in a sense, what you don't want to hear, although it might be the truth, is, well, I'm doing it because I have to do it. Because the difference, I think, is this: if someone has an interest in the qualification and a motivation to learn and develop, that again is an important lifelong skill and lifelong commitment that they need to have, really, to being a leader and manager. Because as a leader and manager, well, as a human being, really, you are constantly learning, and there will be challenges in your way, but you need to have that motivation to keep on going no matter what. And similarly, at this point, by setting this initial assessment, you are getting some insight into a person's reliability and commitment. So, for example, you've set them the personal statement to write, you've asked them to return it to you by a certain date, you've said that you'll contact them to have a discussion. Do they deliver according to your expectations? Do they complete the task? Do they email it to you as requested? Do they arrange to have a discussion with you? If they are not there, what you don't want to, it might happen, but at least it would give you the insight, is, for example, are they there on the date of the discussion? If they have to rearrange, do they rearrange appropriately? Because these are all giving you an insight into who that person is, where they are in terms of their commitment to learning. The personal statement then, in terms of them being able to identify what they're looking forward to and why, and what they're worried about and why, then it gives you a really nice grounding for discussion in terms of any further skills development that they might have, and you being aware, for example, if they've got caring responsibilities, and also working out if there are any specific support needs. Again, I would stress, if there are specific support needs, it is really critical not to just hope for the best. And because the last thing you want, it is just so demoralizing, really, both for the learner or the student and for the tutor and for the centre, to rush along into something, hoping for the best, and then being bitterly disappointed. Whereas if you could take the time, and it may, result in a slight delay, but if you could take that time to make sure that that grounding is there and the induction is there, that will be it will just save so much time and so much angst in the long term. The other thing that I'd say is that what can be useful is to think about a learner or student's readiness in terms of a traffic light system. So you've got to know this learner and this student now, and where do you think they are? So, for example, do you think that your student is in the green zone? And by that, what I mean is that you feel confident that their skills are well developed, so they have really sound written and verbal communication skills. You feel happy with their ability to research, for example, to search on the internet, and their ability to use and access IT. And you feel comfortable that they have thought about when they will have time or make time, because it is often, isn't it, that we have to make time. We've never got time, but we have to make time for independent learning. And also at this point, you can get an insight in terms of where they are as regards support from their employer, because that is relevant as well. In the ideal world, what you would want is that the learner and student and the employer have come together and worked out when they will have their study time, and that's what you're looking for, really. And then, as I said earlier, you might feel that the student is in the green zone because it is really obvious that they have a real commitment to completing this qualification. And as the tutor and as the centre, you feel that confident that if they have any specific needs, the support is in place. So you can see that there is this partnership developing at this point, because it is about asking, is the learner or student ready? But it is also about asking, are we as a tutor or we as a centre ready, in terms of making sure that we can support this learner or student to get the best possible outcomes from their learning. Now, if a student is in the amber zone, it could be that what you feel is that there are some gaps, and this is where your judgment really comes into it. So it could be that you can see there is an ability to use and access IT, and there's time for independent learning, and the skills are sufficient. So what you feel is that the student has got the commitment to complete this qualification, the support is in place to meet the specific needs, and you can see that the potential is there, and you can see that they're almost there, but perhaps there are skills. The skills are there in your mind, from what you've seen, from what you've observed. You can see that the skills are sufficient, and because of the student's commitment and because of other support that you can put in place, although you feel that the student is perhaps in the amber zone in terms of being ready, with, for example, the support of formative assessments and any other support, there is a feeling that you could still go ahead. The red zone then is really, what is there anything that is raising red flags for you? So, for example, did you read this person's personal statement? Or did you have a discussion with this person and you have really strong reservations because what you feel is that the skills are really inadequate at this stage? It's not about, for example, refining what is already there. It could be that you have some real concerns about literacy at this stage. Or is it to do with their inability to use or access IT, or that you've got reservations about the time that they have for independent learning? Commitment is a really tricky one but what I would say is, is there an evident lack of commitment? And also, is there no support? Now, in terms of that red zone, what I would say is it's really important, and this is very much based on experience. I would urge you not to proceed until anything that is a red flag to you is resolved. Because as I say, what you want the learner, the student to succeed. And in a sense, this is the point at which any difficult conversations have to be had. And it's so much better, although it's never pleasant, to have those difficult conversations or to, deal with those thorny issues at this point before proceeding. So the induction is really important, and you would have been sent an information sheet which gives you further information in terms of what I'm going to talk about now. So what can be useful is to have an individual learning plan or a timetable for this unit to support a learner or student to develop their skills. Also, for the learner or student to identify a mentor. And I'll just sort of touch upon that. In your information sheet, there is information about mentors. Now, we suggested that to our students that they think about having a mentor. So the mentor will be additional support to that provided by the tutor and the centre. And what we found was that for some students, having a mentor worked really well. So we encourage students to have a mentor. Now, the mentor isn't necessarily the student's manager, for example, because the role of a mentor is to support a person to develop, and key parts of a good mentoring relationship is that you feel you can be honest with your mentor, and also you respect them. Usually they're senior to you, they're usually more experienced than you, but it is that thing about having implicit trust in your mentor and feeling that you can tell them anything really. And we found that for a lot of our students, having a mentor worked really well. The mentor could also provide the learner or the student with support in terms of their learning and their assessments. Now, when I say that, obviously, it's not for them to do that learners or students' work for them, but it's just that thing about another key role that a mentor can play, which works out brilliantly, is they can bounce, the learner or the student can bounce ideas off the mentor. They can talk to the mentor about perhaps what they're finding difficult in terms of their learning. So it's just something to think about in terms of whether you would want to encourage a learner or student to take on a mentor, because it is an additional form of support. Also, in the induction, there are practical exercises. So, for example, I really like Social Care Institute for Excellence. They have social care TV videos, and they have those videos on a whole range of subjects. I'm sure you've seen them before, but it's a nice little starting point. So we're talking about induction. It can be a nice little starting point to for example, ask someone to watch a particular video to then generate discussion. The other thing is, in the information sheet, there was something that worked really well for our students, and they actually really enjoyed doing it. And that was where in the information sheet you'll see we set a practical exercise, and what we did was two versions of writing about the same topic. So what we said was, well, the title is, how does academic writing differ to everyday writing? And the instructions were, read the following two sections of text as informal writing and academic writing. Then we asked the students to look at the two pieces of text, both written about the same topics, but one was written in a informal writing style, whereas the other section was written in terms of a formal writing style or an academic writing style. And then what we asked the students to say is, well, how do they differ? And that practical exercise really worked well with students, because for quite a few, the penny dropped in terms of, well, what do we mean by academic skills? And what do we mean by formal writing compared to what do we mean by informal writing? Also, in terms of the induction, if you can see that a learner or a student will require further support with academic skills, I did a search. This is just one suggestion. You might already, chances are you've got resources where you are, or you feel that there's other resources that would be more useful. So this is just a suggestion. But I went on to the BBC Teach and BBC Academic writing resources, and I felt there were some really useful resources there that could be used to support a student during their induction. So hopefully that's given you some ideas of what you might want to include in terms of your induction. And then, so what you've done is you've done the initial assessment. You've also gone through induction, and I would say it really doesn't harm to revisit that traffic light system again. And it is just really for the learner and the student and yourself to reassure yourself, both of you really, that you're in the right place. So after doing the induction and realizing what's involved, is the student still good to go? It could be that as a result of the, for example, that they did some work during the induction, they've built upon their existing academic skills. It could be that actually you feel they're more in the green zone than the amber zone. And it gives you time, both you and the learner and the student, to take stock and think, are there any red flags remaining that still need to be resolved? And a major one that I would say is to make sure that that support is in place. Because if support for specific needs isn't in place, unfortunately, I think that can risk a lot. And I do think it's a real shame, because it's the difference between a learner or a student going forward and feeling confident and feeling that they can do this, and the difference between a learner or a student feeling that they can't. Because what we found on the pilot award is that one of the things that our students struggled with was confidence. And so given that some students or learners may already be starting from a fairly low point of confidence, what you would really hate to do is take that confidence down even further, when actually what it came down to was addressing something from a practical basis. Okay, so in terms of the learning content for this unit, and bearing in mind, this is the very first unit of the qualification, it is critical for a learner or student to understand the relationship between theory and practice and why this is important. And it can be useful to support them to do this with some everyday contemporary examples. So, for example, I just did a really quick search on the internet yesterday, and what came up was, for example, the history of mental health treatment and the way in which theories around mental health have changed, and as a result, the way in which people who experience, for example, mental illness have been changed in terms of the way that they are treated. So that would be one example. An even more contemporary example is the fact that we're in this pandemic, and if you look at, for example, conspiracy theories versus science, you know, that's just so right at the minute at the moment. And so there's an interesting discussion to be generated there. In terms of the guidance that is there, so there's the qualification handbook, there's the assessment handbook, and so there's the qualification handbook, and there's a list of key resources. And what I would say to you is that it's very important that those key resources are there to be helpful. And it's really important that both the learner or student and yourselves as tutors and centres don't feel overwhelmed. So the point is that those resources are there to be helpful, but it is to say that the learner or student isn't expected to read every page of every document or every page of every website. And in actual fact, this is one of the key skills that someone on this qualification is going to develop, is going onto the internet, going onto a website page, going onto a document and finding and researching the information that is needed to meet the requirements of their formative or summative assessment. Similarly, the tutors, what I would say to is, personally speaking, I wouldn't try and get to grips with all of that knowledge in relation to all 3 units all at the same time. I would pace myself, and that's what I used to do. And in a sense, really tread that journey along with the learner and the student and encourage them to look at what they need to look at. So, for example, I'll give you a practical example. In one of the first learning outcomes, it's about equality and diversity. And one of the requirements is to understand key terms such as equality, diversity, and discrimination. But what I would encourage the learner or student to do is, for example, go onto the Equality and Human Rights website and look for those 3 key terms. They're not expected to sort of work their way through the whole of the Equality and Human Rights Commission website, but they are expected to seek out the information that they need to meet the requirements of their formative or summative assessment. In terms of affirmation and challenge, reflection in and on after action, so remembering that on this qualification, the learner or student will be employed, so paid or unpaid, or have access to a work placement within health and social care. They will access learning resources, so for example, video, website, PowerPoint presentation or article. And the affirmation and challenge, the reflection, is a really critical part of this qualification. So in a sense, one of the things that I still love about learning is when I can say, oh, do you know, I never thought about that issue in that way, or I never thought about it in that way, or looking back now that I know this. And that's what you are doing with the learners and students that you will support. You will have learners and students from lots of different backgrounds and lots of different care and support backgrounds. And in a sense, no one could expect any tutor or any centre to have in-depth expertise on every area of care and support. Your skill and your strength to support learners and students is that you are giving them the skills, for example, research skills, reflective skills, to go on and be effective learners. So to be independent learners, because that's what they'll need, not just on this qualification, but also in terms of going on to be future leaders and managers. And the point that I'm just making in terms of not to have a judgmental approach, obviously, unless there's a safeguarding issue, is the best conversations are the honest conversations. So in terms of, you know, you may get, for example, a learner or a student saying, you know, when I've learned about this issue and I've looked at issues, for example, such as oppression or empowerment, or, you know, different issues, and now I look back on my practice from previously and I feel embarrassed about it. And it is about having that non-judgmental approach and really encouraging someone to say, well, okay, I do feel embarrassed about that, but I've learned this, and it's really reshaped and reformed how I will go forward. Because I think, you know, in terms of learning, we're all learning every day, and as humans, we're never perfect. That's the nature of us at the end of the day, and it is really important that to get the most from any learning experience, you can be honest about it. And so key questions is that they've accessed the learning resources, they've developed their knowledge, and questions around, you know, it might be that they think, yeah, I was on the right track, or I'm going to change the way that I do something. Because ultimately, yes, this is a qualification grounded in an academic basis, but from the point of view of improving practice. Okay, so that brings us up to 2 o'clock, and we will be back at 2:30. A break. Obviously, make yourself a tea or coffee or whatever you need to do. And my suggestion for your short activity during the break is that you access one of the BBC websites. So just look at one of the BBC websites, for example, BBC Teach or BBC Academic Writing, as potential resources for the development of skills. So if you get a minute during your break, have a look at them and see if you feel that they may be useful in terms of supporting your learners or students. And we'll see you back at 2:30 p.m.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Matilata, and we'll see you back at 2:30. Question and answer session. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had opportunity to have a quick look at the BBC websites and that you may find them useful in terms of informing your thinking about the induction. One of the questions that Karen asked me during the break was on the pilot award, what was our retention rate like? And basically, off the top of my head, my memory is that the retention rate was around about 80%. So we had a very high retention rate. And I think that one of the reasons for that was because we did really take our time at the very beginning in terms of the induction and in terms of asking those searching questions, both of the learner or student and also in terms of the employer. I'm going to finish talking through the assessments by 3:10 so that we have time to talk through any questions or issues that anyone might have. As I said, we're now going to talk about the assessment and laying foundations for success. And really, in terms of the pilot, we made sure that we were preparing for the assessment from the very start. So my suggestion is that the preparation for the assessment should begin from the very first week of learning by setting the learner or student a small task to be completed at the end of each period of learning as a formative or practice tasks or assessments. So the information sheet that's been sent to you, there is some suggestions there. For example, on the front sheet, there's a example of an individual learning plan. And so the suggestion is that the formative tasks relate to the final summative assessments in some way. So, for example, that you get them to structure a written account, or you set them a task so that they can work on reading a question and understanding what is being asked within it so that they respond appropriately, or write a reference list. So the idea is that by the time the student or learner reaches the summative assessment, there's no surprises, because by then there should be a series of steps. So you've had that robust initial assessment in terms of asking them to write their written account of why they want to do the qualification. You've also had a sound induction, so you've taken your time over the induction, and then this is the next layer of support in terms of doing a series of structured, consistent, formative tasks that have been completed by the learner or the student, so that by the time they reach the summative assessment, there should be no surprises or even no shocks, because that preparation has started from the very beginning and it's been incremental. And so it's sort of really gone into the fibre of their learning, which means that they're leading up to it. So on that information sheet that I've distributed, I have provided some suggestions of some tasks that you might find useful. So, for example, there's detail there about providing a short written account in terms of identifying key legislation, giving reasons why some equality and diversity in this instance is important, and including a reference list, because all those sorts of things, for example, a reference, doing a reference list, it might be something that someone hasn't done before, so it is something that it puts them in good stead if they're starting it from the very beginning. And it's like anything really, in that the more often you complete a task, the more familiar it will be and the less daunting it will feel. So in terms of the assessments, a reminder that there is the assessment pack, March 2020 version 1.1. As regards the assessments for this unit, they are to be marked internally and the result is to be submitted to City and Guilds. Task A involves a written response. Task B involves a written response. Task C, the learner or student will be provided with a scenario to be read and reviewed, and the learner or student has up to 60 minutes of preparation time following release of the task, and up to 30 minutes with the assessor to discuss their responses verbally. It's to remember as well that the assessments are to be completed in sequence and one at a time. So the guidance makes it clear that the assessments should not, for example, be released all at once. They should only be completed when the learning materials for the unit have been worked through and in sequence. So basically, task A, task B, followed by task C. There's other guidance there within the pack that says that candidates should be able to complete the assessments in a quiet environment where they won't be disturbed. They are permitted to refer to relevant reference sources or materials, and they must clearly identify them in their work. And that is a fundamental aspect of this qualification, is rather than, for example, it just thoughts are communicated as if from thin air, they should be evidenced by reference to relevant sources and materials that are included. Really, that you have the PowerPoint presentation and you have the resources that are listed in the qualification pack and also in the assessments. Also, the candidate is required to sign a declaration of authenticity form, which is in Appendix 4 in the assessment pack, to confirm that the work is their own, and the internal assessor is responsible for flagging or marking any concerns with the submitted work, and they must also sign the declaration form. A key message is that a timetable is essential. And my suggestion is that what happens from the very start is that you have a combination really of a schedule of learning and the task release date. So on the information sheet that you've been provided with, there is, you know, by all means, if you don't think it would work for you, then change it. But it's just something that something practical that I hoped might be helpful, in the sense of, on the final sheet of the information sheet, I've provided an example of a timetable that combines both a list of the learning content and the assessment. So what I've created, for example, for the first learning outcome 1, the first column relates to the date. So the date, the week commencing that the student or learner would be beginning their learning on that particular learning outcome. So for example, learning outcome 1. I've then created a column relating to the assessment criteria. So in the example I've given, the assessment criteria is: you understand 1.1 legislation and policy that support equality and diversity, and 1.2 the impact of stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination and hate crime on well-being. And then, and this is the value of the timetable, the action to be taken, detailing the formative tasks. So there's the example of what I was saying, in terms of from the very start, from the very first learning outcome, it is a good idea to start giving the learner or student tasks, small tasks that they can, to enable them to develop their skills and be familiar with the way of working on this qualification. So for example, for learning outcome 1, to work through the theme objectives, the topics to cover, and that's in the qualification handbook, and the resources linked to learning outcome 1. And as I said, you're not expected to read through everything, but instead use your skills to draw out the information needed to meet the assessment criteria, to meet the requirements of the learning outcome. And then also I've added a column there, complete the tasks in action to be taken. So in that final column, there is some examples of some formative tasks that perhaps you could think about. And obviously you'll design your own formative tasks that you feel will be useful and supportive for your learners and students. So the two examples I've given there is for the student to provide a short written account, and also then to have a discussion with their tutor or work together in class, depending on the nature of where the learner or student is completing their qualification. What I've suggested here is that you could have 1 page per learning outcome. So for this first unit, there are 9 learning outcomes, and this template could be used to set out the different learning outcome and the different formative tasks. The way in which this is useful as well is that if you have this timetable of learning content, which is then leading up to the task release dates, if upon completion of the tasks, something doesn't go as planned. So for example, unfortunately, the feeling is, you know, based on marking the work, you have to ask someone to resubmit a piece of work. That timetable, which will also document the tasks, that the formative tasks that the learner or student completed, and the feedback that they received on it, it's a good source, a good record, and a good source of history there for you both the tutor and the centre and the learner. If there are conversations to be had about, well, I asked you to do this task, but it wasn't completed, or I provided you feedback on this formative tasks, but there isn't evidence that you followed up. So sometimes it can be quite a devastating experience to have to resubmit a piece of work. And so, especially, you know, if someone's worked really hard on something, and part of the support then is about unpicking what didn't go to plan. What do we need to do differently next time to make sure that when this piece of work is resubmitted, it does pass? So that's why I strongly recommend that not only is there a timetable that records task release dates, but also a timetable of learning. The other thing is as well, that with that program of learning, it might be, as it happens in everybody's lives, we had it with our students, personal events would happen. For example, sadly, someone would experience a bereavement, or relationship breakdown. It could be anything really, that would mean there would have to be a revision of that program of learning and task release dates. And again, because you've got that template there, you've got everything that you need to be able to restructure arrangements, and you've got that history there. So pages 27 to 28 of the assessment pack contains past criteria and coverage of the relevant units for each assessment. So task A makes reference to learning outcomes 1 to 3, 5 and 9. Task B makes reference to learning outcomes 6, 7 and 8, and task C makes reference to learning outcomes 4 and 5. And as I say, the assessment tasks shouldn't be released to a learner or student until after all of the unit content has been delivered, and the tasks must not overlap. So it is just so important, because as I say, you know, chances are learners and students are juggling a number of different priorities and a number of commitments as it is. And so there really is no merit to burdening a learner or a student by requiring them to do more than one task at once. And the other important thing is the point of a sequential order to these tasks is the fact that if a student completes task A and there is something about their submission that requires improvement and they have to resubmit, whatever learning they gain from task A, they can then take on to task B and subsequently to task C. So again, just a quick, is the learner or student ready? I would say it's just important, really, I suppose, with any tutor, centre and learner or student relationship, to keep checking. And that should happen anyway, because you develop that relationship to support the student. And so in terms of, is the student ready, the green would be that the student, you're confident that the student understands what is required and they respond appropriately. So when they've been set formative tasks and formative assessments, they've understood the task and they've responded appropriately. They've met your expectations. They understand the relationship between theory, legislation, policy, and person-child-centered practice. So they can make clear links between practice and what underpins that practice. And they are able to present a list of resources relating to the task. The amber may relate to a learner or student who has some understanding of what is required, but sometimes you find that you need to revisit something because perhaps they put emphasis not quite in the right place, or they've misunderstood the task. But with further guidance, they have understood what is expected of them. They draw some links between theory, legislation, policy, and personal child-centered practice, but it might be that they need some prompting, some encouragement, and that needs to be developed further. They don't present a reference list of resources. Now, I think the ability to present a reference list of resources is really important, because it is the whole issue of not just presenting a piece of work based on anecdotal thoughts or observations. It is a very grounded, well-supported piece of work that is strongly supported by evidence. And then in terms of someone who gives you concern, raises red flags for you, is you've set that learner or that student formative tasks and they don't seem to understand what is required, or there's no link there between theory, legislation, policy and person-child-centered practice. Now, I've known that in the past where we'll have a piece of work submitted and there isn't a single reference in there, or really any reference to theory or legislation, and it is literally, it looks like somebody has thought, I've got to get this in tomorrow, I'll just hope for the best. And to be honest, that isn't going to meet the expectations of the qualification. And also the red flag is that they're not presenting a reference list. So just, you know, it is useful to keep checking back, because student circumstances, learners' circumstances do change. And at the end of the day, you want that learner or the student, and they do too, want to be able to meet the requirements of the assessment tasks and ideally get a pass first time. So in terms of evidence to consider that leads to a pass, and I've based this on the way in which we assessed students on the pilot. So obviously you need to follow the guidance in the assessment pack, which is in pages 27 to 28 for tasks A to C. And in terms of, well, what does this look like? I would be looking for use of an appropriate structure. So for example, does the written response, for example, have a clear introduction so that the learner or student is saying, this is what I'm going to do? A body of discussion, so that's drawing out some of the key points and some of the key arguments, and a conclusion or a summary. So there should be a structure there, because one of the things that I said earlier on in terms of the presentation, in terms of this unit and the qualification as a whole, is that yes, it is about developing academic skills, formal writing skills, formal presentation skills in relation to achieving this level 4 qualification. But it is also about developing communication skills, written and verbal, and an ability to communicate information in a clear and succinct way, because ultimately this qualification is to support people to pursue a career in leadership and management. And to have a career in leadership and management, there will be a requirement to have these skills. And so in terms of the evidence that leads to a pass, there is the expectation that there will be a structured, well thought out, conscientious response. Someone has taken care. You can see that someone has taken care to produce this piece of work, and they've met the criteria that has been set out for them. And similarly, the oral assessment evidence is reason, verbal communication. So for example, if questions are asked of a learner or a student, they're able to answer those questions, but also give sound reasoning for their responses. Also, evidence that leads to a pass, that relevant knowledge is communicated. So it isn't just a case of, I remember this from this unit and I remember that from this unit. It has to be relevant to the task that has been presented to the learner or the student. And so there is communication of references and clear links between legislation, policy, codes, guidance, and the leadership and management of and child-centered practice. The other expectation is that a reference list is presented to support the assessment. And so what you've got here in terms of a pass is that a piece of work is well thought out, the learner or student has taken care, and they have presented a sound rationale of it to support any points that they're making through the support of appropriate evidence. Evidence that leads to a need to resubmit. Again, there is guidance in the assessment pack for the pass criteria for tasks A to C. And there is evidence of a need to resubmit if the learner or student presents a lack of structure to the assessment. So, for example, I can clearly remember one of our students submitted an assessment literally with a list of bullet points. And unfortunately, they had to resubmit. When we spoke to that student, they said, I ran out of time. And I thought, well, at least if I submit a list of bullet points, you never know, I just thought I'd give it a go. Well, unfortunately, that it just fell really short of expectations, because, for example, if you can imagine, you were asked to present a report by your management committee and you circulated a document with a list of bullet points. My guess is that there's lots of management committees that aren't going to be impressed by that. So yes, this is a qualification, but it is about, within learners and students, developing those leadership skills. So them taking responsibility for the quality of their work and taking care over the quality of their work and doing what is asked of them and meeting expectations. Or it could be that there's a need to resubmit because there's no coherent flow to the writing. So it could be that you have to sort of pick out the key points. There's no natural flow to the communication. There's no natural pattern to everything. And you have to do the work in terms of trying to salvage something from the task. So unfortunately, that would very likely lead to a need to resubmit. Similarly, the oral assessment. If you find that at the oral assessment, the learner or student doesn't really have much to say, or what they say doesn't actually relate to the task, and they can't make clear links between what they've learnt and the scenario that is in the practical assessment, there may be a need then to resubmit. Another critical part is there could be a lack of or minimal relevant knowledge that is communicated, with no or minimal references and no or few links between legislation, policy, codes, guidance, and the leadership and management of child-centered practice. As I say, it won't be acceptable to rely on anecdotal thoughts or anecdotal observations. The work must be supported by relevant evidence. And also, there is an expectation that a reference list is presented to support the assessment. There is guidance there regarding resubmissions. So if you look at page 16 in the assessment pack, there's information there about resubmission of tasks A to C. In terms of task A, which is the written task, the candidate can resubmit the original task. In terms of task B, which again is a written task, the candidate's response should focus on either a different theory or model to their initial response, or they should focus on a different specific example from their experience. And in terms of task C, an alternative scenario to the original scenario should be provided. Resubmissions are unlimited, but the aim should be to pass first time, because unfortunately it is demoralizing if you have to resubmit work. And so obviously every time you have to resubmit something, the danger is that morale drops deeper and motivation drops as well. And the worst possible outcome is that then somebody doesn't complete the unit and doesn't complete the qualification, which obviously then affects their future plans. So really, although resubmissions are unlimited, I would say it's not the ideal culture. Personally speaking, I would say for me, it isn't the ideal culture to say, well, put it in and give it a go. My feeling is that what should be happening is that you and the learner or student are confident that they have worked hard, they have met the requirements of the qualification, that, as I said previously, when they submit the assessment and they get the result back, there are no nasty surprises, and they can then move on to their next task or the next unit. Okay, so that concludes my slides. It doesn't quite conclude the masterclass, because obviously we'll move on to take questions. Before we do that, it's just to say that I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next masterclass. So in terms of Unit 411, Theoretical Frameworks for Leadership and Management in Health and Social Care. So the next masterclass, we'll move on to talk about this unit. So this unit then, Unit 411, Theoretical Frameworks for Leadership and Management in Health and Social Care. In that masterclass, what I'll be doing is giving an overview of Unit 411 and how to use different forms of evidence, such as theories, research, codes and legislation to improve practice in health and social care. I'll also demonstrate how the presentations identified in the qualification guidance can be used for a resource for learners and students. So across all of the units, there is usually reference to a PowerPoint presentation. And that PowerPoint presentation, in relation to this unit that we've just discussed as well, is, I would say, is a good starting point. It's a good way of introducing the learner or student to that particular learning outcome. And what I will do is go through one of those PowerPoints to show how it can be used as that initial starting point. Also, what will happen in relation to my sort of input for that unit next time is that I'll show you a practical example to guide of how you can guide learners and students through development of their report and presentation prior to assessment. So what I've produced that you'll see next time is an example of practice, and how that is underpinned by different sources of evidence. So that's what I will cover in the next masterclass next week. So I hope you have found this masterclass interesting and also helpful. And I will now press escape on this, and but I won't escape. I'll stay with it until the end, and I'll link back up with Karen and my colleagues and yourself for us to answer any questions or queries.
Okay, thanks very much, Maddalata. If people want to put their cameras on now, if they think their broadband is going to handle that, then please do. Be good to see some lovely faces, especially Maddalata, to know that she's not been talking to just a blank screen the whole time. Okay, so there are a number of questions that have come through, and we'll pick up on some of those now. I think Susie's been busy answering quite a lot of them as they've been coming up, but there are a couple that might be worth repeating to the whole group. I guess just before we go on to those, just very, very quickly, I just want to say a little bit about the Step Up to Management programme, which is the pilot programme or the pilot qualification that the Preparing for Leadership and Management qualification was based on. We've just taken it, we've transformed it into the Preparing for Leadership and Management, basically. You know, it's the same learning outcomes, it's very, very similar, it's the same learning resources that are being used. And I was involved in the development of the pilot. I started work on the rollout across Wales, and then I got kidnapped by Qualifications Wales to work on the new suite of qualifications. So I had to leave it to Maddalata to take that forward. But what I would say is my observation of people who had completed the Step Up to Management qualification is that it was transformational in a way that I've never experienced or seen before for a qualification. The first lot of interviews we did for people to do the pilot, to undertake the pilot, we only set the entry at a minimum level 2 in health and social care, because we didn't want to disadvantage anybody who might be, say, a domiciliary care worker who'd never had an opportunity to undertake a level 3 qualification, because that wasn't a requirement for their role. So we set it at level 2, and we had some people that came along that had level 2 qualifications that had not had an opportunity to do any more. We had, I remember interviewing somebody to go on the qualification, and I can see her now in front of me, and she said, I've not been in a classroom for 40 years. I'm really, really nervous about this. I'm really anxious about it. And then to see, we had I think we had something like a 99% completion, attrition, a non-attrition rate for that. It was fantastic for the pilot. And then to see people at the end of it, and to look at the presentations that they had put together for the change that they had completed, so looking at, you know, an area of practice that they wanted to change, and listening to them, and observing an activity where they were given a scenario, a little bit like the one that we talked about in Task C. They were given a scenario, and we were able to actually observe them undertaking a piece of work where they discussed that scenario. And I saw more clarity in relation to those students and those learners, making clear links between theory, policy, legislation and codes and practice than I'd seen, you know, in any other qualification. So I guess what I want to say is that, you know, this qualification is really, really important. It can transform the way that people think. It can transform the way that people behave as they move into those leadership and management roles. And I think if there's anything that anybody that's worked in social care over years has discovered or realised, is the importance of a leader and a manager on the delivery of high quality social care services. So I just wanted to say that, because obviously I'm still feeling very passionate about this as a qualification and the impact that it can have on service delivery, as well as the confidence and the competence of those people who are managing and leading that service delivery. So that's my little bit of a rant over. So we've got a few questions that we probably want to pick up on. Susie, if you can come in here with some that you think it might be worth just clarifying as they've been coming through the chat box. We've got one which is about plagiarism. I think it might be helpful to reiterate some of that.
I mean, certainly because of the nature of the assessments in this qualification, the risk for plagiarism probably is a lot greater than in other qualifications. However, every approved centre, regardless, would have to have a plagiarism policy in place. It's part of the malpractice, maladministration processes. So because of the nature of these qualifications, you're still following a mix of internal and external assessments. So for the internal assessments, which are relevant to Unit 410, you would be following a BARCS process based on the supportive information in the assessment pack, and watching out for plagiarism would be part of that process. So it wouldn't be sufficient just to sort of use plagiarism checking process on its own. There would be other things that would need to be in place to make sure that the assessment of the internal assessment components are confirmed as the learner's own work, because it only has to be set under controlled conditions. The learner doesn't have to be supervised continually, a bit like the internal assessments of the core.
And the other thing that would give you pointers to that is if the formative assessment tasks have been carried out prior to that formal assessment or that summative assessment, then, you know, I think it will be quite clear if it's not that learner's own work, if all of a sudden you get something which is radically different to those small assessment tasks they've been completing up until that point in time.
Absolutely, Karen, and I think a lot of colleagues have mentioned earlier on in the chat that that's the process that they had put in place, that they were doing little small bite-sized formative assessment activities that sort of are preparing the learner, as Magdalena has been suggesting, to cope well with the final assessment points, and they tell a story. It's about looking out for those cues as assessors, and making sure that you will be close to these learners and you'll get a feel for how they approach things, the style of language that they use, and if it suddenly changes, then that is usually a clue that perhaps they have drawn from either an external source or they've had some additional support pulling that together. Magdalena, you referred earlier on to the role of a mentor. And it's really important that if you do have learners that are being supported by a mentor or a coach, that the parameters of that role are really carefully explained, so that we're sure that any assessments coming in that are summative assessments are in fact the learner's own work and are not being supported in a way that would give them an unfair advantage.
Yeah, absolutely, because we had a case where unfortunately we had to discount a submission because what had happened is a student had the support of a former student who had been on the award, and as you say, it's to make it very clear that there is a difference between support and doing something for someone. Mm-hmm. And to make that very clear from the start.
Okay, there are a couple of questions there about referencing as well, and whether that needs to be formal Harvard referencing.
We haven't said that within the qualification, but it does need to be a recognised and consistent referencing process. So, that is for individual centres to sort of put in place. Harvard is the most well-used one. And there are lots of resources out there that support Harvard referencing, but it is a decision that you need to make at centre level, what system and process you're going to use around that. But academic referencing tends to have some common themes. Consistency and accuracy are the two main things that you would be looking out for there.
Okay. One of the other questions that came up a couple of times was about whether the learning needed to be completed for all units before assessment, or whether it's just the learning is delivered one unit at a time, and whether there can be any overlap. So,
okay, no overlap for assessment. which kind of means, you know, that you need to have taught all of the content of Unit 410 before you release the tasks, and the tasks can't be released all at once. So you wouldn't be going, here's task A and B together, off you go. You would agree with the candidate the time frame by which they would have task A back to you, and at that point then you'll be releasing task B, and so on and so forth through the qualification. So you're not delivering all of the learning of the complete qualification, but you are definitely delivering the learning of each unit incrementally, and you would be looking backwards as well. So it's not that you are pursuing this on a more unitized perspective, because there are links between each of the units and they inform each other, but you have to start somewhere. So we are saying 410, 411 and 412 run consistently after each other, and the table that's in the assessment pack that Magdalena referred to in her presentation is there as an example of how you might manage that. A lot of you have e-portfolios, and you may build something into that. Whichever way you manage it, it has to be really, really clear to your internal quality assurer and to our external quality assurers that you have followed that process. Of course, it will become a little bit more challenging if learners have to resit, you know, because you would want to manage that process as well. And you may have a plan to release a task, and actually the degree of resit and resubmission that candidate has been faced with, it may no longer be appropriate to release that second or third task, because they may feel overwhelmed. So you will have to build those contingencies in to your program.
So I guess, you know, a key thing is thinking about the pressure on the learners of, you know, sorry, that's my dog making funny noises, not me. He's only 5.5 months old. He doesn't bark. He just makes sort of groany noises as he stretches. And okay, yeah, it's just thinking about the pressure really on the learners, isn't it? So, you know, so you would want them to complete the assessment task before you start on the learning for the next unit, but really trying to have that clear timetable for people so they know what to expect. I did make some other notes. Okay.
Can I just say something about the live assessment material,
Yes.
Karen? Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah.
You know, in some of the units, there are tasks that are based on scenarios, and in the assessment pack, there are sample scenarios that we are expecting you to use as part of your formative assessment process. The live tasks for the scenarios are not available to any centre at the moment, nor will they be for the next couple of weeks. And that is because we are monitoring when you are registering learners, and we have a sense of when those learners should really ideally be ready for those live assessments. Now it is a bit of action research, you know, so we are looking at your learner journeys, but I need to really stress that those scenarios are live assessment materials. They are not there for tutors and assessors to have a look at and to influence or inform your teaching. They are live assessment materials and should only be accessed when you have a learner who is at that point in their assessment journey. They shouldn't be accessed in any other way by any other individual. So, you know, you may well have a situation where you've got some learners that are ready for task C and other learners who are not ready for task C at this point. You may have some assessors who work with those learners and an assessor who works with a mix of learners at different points on the assessment journey. And therefore it's critically important that you apply JCQ requirements around those live assessment materials, because that protects the integrity of those assessment materials. A bit like why you wouldn't share the case studies to a core learner ahead of them being ready for assessment, and why you would be stressing to candidates why they must not share any insight or information about those live assessment materials. So I know a lot of you are really, really keen to get your hands on those, but that is not best practice. Best practice is for you to be looking at the sample assessment materials that we have made available to you, with confidence that you know, that is the model. It will be that grade of question, that expectation, and when the live assessment materials go on to Health and Care Learning Wales, there will be a password that you'll access in the normal way, and you will be subject then to JCQ requirements around those. So you do perhaps need to have a conversation with your exams departments or whomever in your centre is managing that process. Maybe it's the person that manages the case studies and the questions for the core. Whoever it is, there needs to be a named individual in your centre that's going to help that centre manage that process. Just remember that Unit 410 is 115 GLH. It is not a small unit, 22 credits. It is going to take you a while to teach that unit and to have learners at a point where they are ready for each component assessment. And so it's not going to happen really, really quickly, except, of course, there will be some learners who are at a different starting point. So that's where your initial assessment and your induction and things come in. I emailed out to every approved centre about 3 weeks ago, asking for information from you all about when you felt you might have learners ready at the point of the assessment, and also perhaps ready for unit assessment of Unit 411. And I've only had 2 centres come back to me. So I'm choosing to believe you're very busy. And that, you know, perhaps you've got no learners at that point yet, but some of the conversations we've been having today would imply something different. So if you could share that insight to us, that will help us with planning and help us to help you. So if you could drop me an email, let me know both for health and social care and for childcare where your learners are at. And then I can do my best to support you with access to the stuff that you need to get access to. But without that information, we are working to a time frame that we believe is realistic.
Okay, probably time for another maybe 1, 2 or 2 questions. There's one which is asking about whether there will be any exemplar assessment material showing pass and fail grades available.
Okay, so in the assessment pack, there is the marking criteria that identifies what is at the different levels of grade, and that will be the resource that you will need to utilise. I don't know, Magdalata, whether there would be any value in sharing or gaining access to some of the materials that perhaps you might have, because you might have been using a different marking scheme. So what do you think about that?
Not really, because the marking grid was very different to, I think it would confuse people, to be honest, because the marking grid that we used at the university is very different to the sort of marking criteria that's used by the consortium. Mm-hmm. So it is a difficult one, because ultimately you're starting from 0 in terms of, because I can remember at one steering group meeting, we reached a point on the pilot where we could distribute, but only in the steering group meeting, real sort of practical examples of this is what was a really strong pass, but unfortunately this was what is a resubmission. So I wonder if it's one of those things where maybe further down the line on the qualification, when work has been done, the exemplars can be produced. But at this stage, I think that is quite difficult, because our exemplars, for example, in the university were as a result of actual work that students had produced. Absolutely. And then we could say, this is an example of a really strong pass. This is an example of something that had to be resubmitted. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I was just going to say, in a sense, I wonder if those exemplars are firstly best generated within the centre.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly fairly custom and practice when it comes to new qualifications. You know, the first cohort of learners going through, everybody is trying to feel their way, trying to gauge where things are. but the marking criteria that you have available, you are fairly clear about where the line is. So it's about utilising it, and then in future networks, then perhaps we can have a look at, once learners have come through the EQA process, all of that will tell its own story. And we will be feeding back to you some of the trends and the analysis that we're able to do subsequent to EQA visits, and also the outcome of the external assessment process as well. So those insights will bubble through in time as we get learners through the qualifications. But until we get to that point, it's about learners or assessors making sure you're standardizing the use of those marking criteria.
And I guess we've got another 5 of these masterclasses to go yet, or 2 masterclasses and then the 3 support network groups. So what we've asked Moderator to do then is do a bit of an evaluation at the end of that, and to look at what else might be needed. So please feed all of these things in, because what we're keen to do is to support you as much as possible. So so I think this is food for thought about the future in what else that we can do to help you. And it's important that you actually say that. Okay, I think we've got 2 minutes left. We've got quite a few people who are leaving. I think probably we need to answer the question about childcare, because that's popped up about 3 or 4 times now, Susie.
It has, yeah, very much.
So,
can I, before perhaps you jump in, Karen, can I just say that we do acknowledge that the early invites for this particular event referred to preparing for leadership and management and didn't really identify which qualification, but subsequent information that's gone out to centres has been very clear that these sessions were for the health and social care for the 804009 qualification. And Karen, do you want to say a little bit more about what will happen at the end of this process?
Yeah, so at the end of this process we will evaluate. Obviously we need to see whether there's value in sort of providing these masterclasses for you, and I guess if there's evidence that they have been helpful and we need to pull something together for the CCPLD, then we will do that. But we wanted to start with these. We've obviously got Modulata, and her expertise has been the course leader for this particular qualification, so we were able to capitalise on that really quickly. And it just came from a conversation that we had with learning providers last November in some events we were doing, and some anxieties that we picked up on there, and we were just able to respond really quickly and getting these up and running. So we will evaluate, and we will see whether there is some mileage or whether there's some value in actually providing them for CCPLD as well.
I just think I spotted something, just trying to find it in here before we close for the day, and I can't find it anymore.
There was one about social care placement.
Yes, that's what it was. That's
yes.
Well done, spotted, Karen. You and I are like-minded on this. So this is a knowledge-only qualification, guys. So the placement expectation or the access to employment will come into its own at level 5. The assessment of this qualification is that the individuals are drawing on their experiences, and it would be useful if they were in placement, and most learners will be in employment, and if they're doing an apprenticeship, then they will have to be in employment to do the apprenticeship. But it is a knowledge only qualification, the level 4 preparing.
Okay, 15:31, we said we'd finish on time, so we're 1 minute over. Just thanks everybody for your contributions and all of your questions. We will have time to revisit this, so any of the things that you think about and you want us to revisit when we come back for the second session on this, please do. Thanks for your patience with our technical glitches earlier on. I hope it put a smile on some people's faces. It certainly did ours. So just over to Modulata for some last words.
Yeah, I hope that you have found it useful, and as I say, it is very much suggestions based on experience, and it is for you to carve your own path really in terms of what you think will be helpful to your learners and your students, and look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks everybody.
Bye everybody.
Thank you.